President Trump has threatened to use the Insurrection Act in Minnesota following an attack on an ICE agent. DHS says the agent was ambushed by an illegal immigrant and hospitalized. Joining us to discuss is Andrew Arthur, fellow in law and policy at the Center for Immigration Studies and former immigration judge. So, Andrew, good afternoon. To start off, maybe you can explain for us simply what is the Insurrection Act and what are the legal conditions that need to be met to allow a president to use it?
So the Insurrection Act actually dates back to 1807. It's been utilized about 30 times in American history, most recently in 1992 during the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. But Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson all used the Insurrection Act in order to enforce the civil rights laws. And President Reagan also used it in response to a prison riot in Atlanta. What it does is it allows the president to call up the militia, in this instance, the National Guard or the regular forces of the United States, whenever any assemblage or group of people makes it impossible to enforce immigration law otherwise, or to enforce federal law otherwise. So those are the conditions, and the Supreme Court has been very liberal with respect to the interpretation of that. They largely leave it to the executive branch to determine whether it's appropriate and when it's appropriate to utilize that authority to call up the troops in order to protect federal officers who are performing federal duties.
Okay, so on that last part, are you saying that it's rather lenient, legally speaking, that these conditions need to be met to use the act? So the legal bar is not that high?
No, the Supreme Court has regularly deferred to the executive branch when it's appropriate and how it's appropriate to use the Insurrection Act. So, yeah, I mean, this is one of those powers that the president has for political reasons. It really hasn't been used a lot in the last 34, hadn't been used at all in the last 34 years. But it is one of those powers that the president has to ensure that federal law can be enforced.
Okay, so Trump says if officials in Minnesota don't stop the agitators and insurrectionists from attacking ICE, he will invoke the act. Is that justification enough?
So, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It all depends on what the situation on the ground in Minnesota is. I've been to Minneapolis in a number of years, but one thing that I do see is that I see active, organized groups of people who are actively attempting to impede ICE officers. There have been ramming attacks in Minneapolis where people have used cars to bump into federal officers. We saw a large mob of people attack a hotel that it believed that ICE officers were in. And, just yesterday we had Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry talking about how his constituents had been asking him to turn the cops out so that they could fight ICE in the streets. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is a situation we haven't had in immigration enforcement ever, and we haven't had in United States law, certainly since, the federal government was attempting to impose desegregation in the South.
Okay, so those are good points, but here's another point. Usually the use of the Insurrection Act is at a governor's request. Is it allowed to be invoked against the governor's wishes?
Absolutely. And, when we talk about Lyndon Johnson, when we talk about John Kennedy, and when we talk about Dwight Eisenhower, all of them used it against the wishes of governors in southern states that didn't want enforcement of Brown versus the Board of Education and other civil rights acts. So, yeah, I mean, if you have defiance of federal authority in a state, that's one of the things that the founders created the Insurrection Act to address. We have one federal law, and it needs to be applied uniformly across the United States without favor or faction.
Okay, can it be argued that the Insurrection Act is not needed because Trump can simply pull out the federal agents from the state, or does upholding immigration law on the federal government's part play into this?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question, Don. In fact, we had an opinion that came out of the Office of Legal Counsel, which is, essentially the law firm within the Department of Justice, in which they talked about the duty that ICE officers and other immigration officers have to enforce the immigration laws as relate to individuals who have entered the United States illegally. Then last January, we had Congress pass the Laken Riley Act. And part of the Laken Riley Act was a restatement by Congress that Congress wants to have criminal aliens taken into custody. When we look at the people who have been arrested in Minneapolis, there's a huge number of people who have committed crimes, up to and including murder and sexual abuse of children, that are being arrested. So Congress literally less than a year ago said, we want those criminals off the street. And today, government officials in Minnesota are attempting to impede ICE from doing so. I mean, it couldn't be any clearer than that.
Andrew, just one final thing. Vice President Vance highlighted on a point on X this week that you're only seeing chaotic ICE raids in blue sanctuary city states. What is your position on this? Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, absolutely, Don. And this is a crucial point. ICE doesn't want to go into those neighborhoods looking for murderers. They don't want to go looking for child rapists in those neighborhoods. They would prefer that the state hand those individuals over to them at the time that those individuals complete their sentences at the state or local level. In fact, that's exactly what the Immigration and Nationality Act says it's supposed to do. But 15 days after Donald Trump became president again, Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, issued an opinion letter that said that no county in Minnesota could hand over criminals directly from custody to ICE, that it couldn't honor the detainers that ICE was attempting to use. Part of the reason, Don, that we don't see, riots like this taking place in Texas or Florida or Georgia or Tennessee is because those states all assist ICE in handing those criminals over. They don't have to go into the neighborhoods. They have them and they can move them out of the country after they receive due process.
Okay, well, Andrew, strong arguments today. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Don. It's good talking to you.